The avoidant is ashamed of how they treated you, even if they never admit it. The most misunderstood truth about avoidant people is this: they are not as emotionally unaffected as they appear. In fact, beneath the distance, the silence, and the cold detachment, there is often a deep, quiet shame about how they treated you. Not guilt in the dramatic, apologetic sense, not remorse that leads to accountability, but a heavy internal discomfort they don't have the emotional tools to face. And that shame doesn't disappear just because they walked away. It follows them into new connections, into solitude, into the moments when distraction fades and they are left alone with themselves. Avoidants are experts at emotional escape. When something feels overwhelming, conflict, vulnerability, expectations, or your pain, they don't move toward it. They move away. That withdrawal is not always intentional cruelty. Often it's self-protection learned early in life. But here's the part people miss. Just because an avoidant avoids emotion doesn't mean they don't feel it. It means they don't know how to process it safely. And shame is one of the hardest emotions for them to sit with, because shame threatens the image they rely on to survive. The image of being independent, self-sufficient, and unbothered. When you cared deeply, communicated honestly, and showed emotional availability, you unknowingly held up a mirror to the avoidant's inner world. Your needs, your hurt, your questions, none of these were wrong. But to an avoidant, they activated something terrifying. The possibility that they failed emotionally, that they hurt someone who trusted them, that they were not as emotionally in control as they believed. And instead of facing that realization, many avoidants shut down, minimize, rewrite history, or disappear entirely. This is where shame quietly enters. Not the kind that leads to growth, but the kind that leads to emotional numbing. Avoidants often tell themselves stories to reduce the discomfort. They were too needy. It just wasn't right. I didn't do anything wrong. These narratives aren't always lies, they're defenses. Because accepting the full truth would require sitting with the pain of knowing they mattered to someone and mishandled that bond. And that level of emotional responsibility feels unbearable to someone whose nervous system learned long ago that closeness equals danger. One of the clearest signs of avoidant shame is how they avoid closure. Notice how rarely avoidants give clean, compassionate endings. Instead, they fade, go silent, become cold, or create distance until the relationship collapses on its own. This isn't confidence, it's avoidance of accountability. A clean ending would require acknowledging impact. It would require seeing your pain as valid, and shame makes that feel threatening. So they leave things unresolved, not because they don't care, but because resolution would expose feelings they don't know how to hold. Another sign is defensiveness. When confronted, even gently, about how they hurt you, avoidants often deflect, minimize, or shift blame. Not because they believe they're perfect, but because being seen as the one who caused pain triggers deep internal distress. Shame tells them, if you admit this, you are flawed, unsafe, or unlovable. And instead of staying present, their system goes into emotional lockdown. Silence becomes safer than sincerity. What's painful is that many avoidants only feel the weight of their actions later, long after the relationship has ended. When you stop reaching out, when you stop explaining yourself, when your energy fully withdraws, that's often when the shame creeps in. Not because they suddenly became emotionally enlightened, but because the distraction of your presence is gone. The nervous system settles, and in the quiet, memory returns. They remember how patient you were, how much space you gave, how many times you tried to communicate without attacking. And that's when the shame deepens, because they recognize, even if subconsciously, that they were treated with more care than they were able to give back. But instead of reaching out vulnerably, many avoidants suppress it further. They distract themselves. They date casually. They keep busy. Anything to avoid sitting with that feeling too long. This is why avoidants often seem fine on the surface while you're left doing the emotional work. They are masters of appearing unaffected, but internally they carry unresolved emotional residue. And shame doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like emotional numbness, irritability, emotional withdrawal, or an inability to fully attach to someone new. One of the most confusing experiences for people who loved avoidance is this. If they feel ashamed, why don't they apologize? And the answer is difficult but important. Shame doesn't move people toward repair. It often moves them toward hiding. Apology requires vulnerability. It requires saying, I hurt you, and that matters. For avoidance, that level of emotional exposure can feel more threatening than loss itself. So instead of repairing, they retreat. This doesn't mean every avoidant is incapable of growth. Some do reach a breaking point. Some eventually confront their patterns. But many don't, not because they're evil, but because their coping strategy is avoidance, not reflection. And shame without emotional tools doesn't become accountability. It becomes silence. Here's the part that matters for you. Their shame is not your responsibility. You don't need to wait for it. You don't need to extract an apology. You don't need to prove your worth so they finally see it. The fact that they feel ashamed internally does not undo the impact of how they treated you. Pain does not disappear just because someone feels bad about causing it. In fact, the healthiest thing you can do is stop orienting your healing around their internal experience. Whether they feel shame, regret, or nothing at all, you still deserve peace, clarity, and emotional safety. And the moment you stop chasing understanding from someone who avoids emotional depth is often the moment their shame becomes louder, because they no longer have access to you to quiet it. Ironically, avoidants tend to respect emotional distance more than emotional pleading. When you step back, stop over-explaining, and reclaim your self-respect, something shifts. Not because you're punishing them, but because you're no longer participating in a dynamic that protected them from facing themselves. And that's when shame has nowhere to hide. But let this be clear, their shame does not mean they will change, and your healing does not depend on whether they ever admit it. Closure is something you give yourself when you stop waiting for emotional honesty from someone who survives by avoiding it. The truth is, someone who truly values connection will not need to be shamed into treating you with care. They won't disappear when things get real. They won't leave you questioning your worth, and you don't need to become colder, quieter, or smaller to be loved correctly. If an avoidant is ashamed of how they treated you, that's something they must face on their own. Your job is not to carry the emotional consequences of their unhealed patterns. Your job is to choose relationships where love doesn't feel like confusion and connection doesn't come with silence as punishment. Because the most powerful realization is this: you didn't lose someone who couldn't love you. You outgrew someone who couldn't meet you. And that is not a loss. That is evolution. If this helped you understand the psychology behind avoidant behavior, take a moment to like the video. It really supports the channel. Share it with someone who needs clarity, not confusion. And subscribe for more deep insights into attachment, healing, and emotional strength.